In 1838, France demanded that Mexico pay them 600,000 pesos for unfair trade and damages to property owned by citizens of France. Mexico refused. So starting in November of 1838, France blockaded all major Mexican ports along the Gulf. Other than the siege of Veracruz, there was very little fighting. After 3 months, the war would end on March 9, 1839, when Mexico agreed to pay the 600,000 pesos and renew trade with France. But Mexico never paid, and France did not forget. Then, in 1857, the War of Reform pitted the liberals, who supported the reforms of the Second Mexican Republic, against the conservatives, who objected to the 1857 Constitution and wanted to restore colonial Spanish values. The liberals under President Juarez would eventually win the war in 1861. But during the course of the conflict, the conservatives had amassed a huge national debt, a debt that the new liberal government was required to pay under international law. But the new regime was bankrupt, and on July 17, 1861, the Mexican Congress voted to suspend all payments of foreign debt until something could be worked out. Britain, France, and Spain were outraged. France was still perturbed that they had not been paid the 600,000 pesos agreed upon in 1839. The British Minister to Mexico, Sir Charles Wyke, called Mexico's decision barefaced robbery. Mexico turned to the United States for help, asking for a loan. Lincoln's administration did have a vested interest in keeping Mexico afloat and keeping the Europeans out of any affairs on this side of the Atlantic. Unfortunately, the American Civil War had just started in April of that same year, and the U.S. needed to focus its financial interests in winning the war at home. On October 31st, Britain, Spain, and France signed the Convention of London, 1861, in which all three powers agreed to send troops to occupy Veracruz until a settlement with Mexico was negotiated. It was intended to be a joint operation, so none of them would appear to be a lone empire seeking to conquer Mexico. On December 8th, the Spanish would land their troops in Veracruz and capture the city without bloodshed. Mexican President Benito Juarez decided not to engage the Europeans, but instead set up a perimeter, effectively blockading the city from any inland routes. On January 8, 1862, the rest of the Allies would follow, and all three nations began negotiations with the Mexican government. Though Britain and Spain were owed far more than France, they were not interested in pressing the conflict further than a military occupation. But both were alarmed when French diplomat Pierre Cellini made threats to escalate the situation into a full-scale war.